The massive space station called Nexus Prime floated in the darkness between stars like a giant metal flower with dozens of arms reaching out in all directions. Ships of every size and shape came and went from its docking bays every few minutes. Some looked like silver teardrops, while others resembled giant insects or floating crystals. The station was home to over 2 million beings from 43 different worlds, and served as the main trading hub for this entire section of the galaxy. Deep inside the station's core, in a room the size of a small city, something very important was broken. The quantum relay system that kept 17 star systems talking to each other had been acting up for 3 months now. Messages took hours to get through instead of seconds. Sometimes they didn't get through at all. Trade deals were falling apart. Families couldn't talk to each other across the stars. Medical supplies weren't reaching colonies that needed them. Commander Krell stood in front of the broken machine and felt his stomach twist into knots. He was a saurian, which meant he looked like a 7-foot-tall lizard that walked on 2 legs and wore a fancy uniform. His green scales had been turning pale gray from stress over the past few weeks. The Galactic Council had sent him 3 messages this week alone: fix the relay or lose his job. Maybe go to prison too. The relay itself was beautiful and terrible at the same time. It filled most of the huge room with twisted metal and crystal that seemed to bend in ways that hurt to look at. Energy flowed through it in colors that had no names. When it worked properly, it could send messages faster than light across thousands of light years in the blink of an eye. Right now, it mostly just hummed and sparked and occasionally made sounds like a dying animal. 28 engineers had tried to fix it. They came from all over the galaxy, and each one was supposed to be the best their species had to offer. The first team had been crystalline architects from the Vega system. They thought in mathematics so complex that most beings couldn't even understand their simple explanations. They spent 2 weeks running calculations and building tiny crystal models of the relay's quantum structure. Then they left shaking their heads and saying the problem was impossible. Next came the silicon-based logicians from Alpha Centauri. Their computer brains could process 1 million possibilities every second. They plugged themselves directly into the station's data networks and ran simulations for days. Their leader, a being that looked like a walking pile of silver circuits, finally announced that the relay was working exactly as it should according to all known physics. The problem had to be somewhere else entirely. The energy beings from the Andromeda Gateway were even stranger. They didn't have bodies in any way that made sense to most other species. Instead, they were pure thought and electricity that floated around in special containment fields. They could manipulate energy directly with their minds and see quantum particles like other beings saw rocks and trees. They spent a week flowing in and out of the relay's energy systems like ghosts. When they finally gave up, their leader said, the machine was cursed by forces beyond understanding. After them came teams of engineers from the Mechanical Collective, the Biosynthesis Union, the Hive Minds of Rigel, and dozen other groups. Each team was more advanced than the last. Each team failed just as completely as the ones before. Dr. Vorthak arrived 3 days ago with the final team. He was a cerebellan, which meant he had 4 brains instead of 1 and could think about different problems with each brain at the same time. His people were known across the galaxy as the greatest problem solvers ever discovered. If anyone could fix the relay, it would be him. Vorthak had been working non-stop since he arrived. His team of 12 specialists had covered every surface of the relay room with monitoring equipment. Screens showed readouts in languages that most beings couldn't even pronounce. Sensors tracked particles so small that billions of them could dance on the head of a pin. Quantum scanners looked into dimensions that existed parallel to normal space. Commander Krell found Dr. Vorthak standing in front of a wall of displays showing nothing but chaos. Random numbers scrolled past faster than any normal being could read. Energy patterns twisted into impossible shapes and then collapsed into static. The cerebellan's 4 brains were working so hard that steam was rising from his skull. Any progress, Doctor? Krell asked, though he already knew the answer from the frustrated way Vorthak's tentacles were writhing. The system defies all logic. Vorthek replied without looking away from his screens. Every component tests as functional. Every connection shows proper energy flow. Every quantum pathway maintains coherence. Yet the system fails to operate correctly. It is as if the universe itself has decided that this machine should not work. Krell's scales turned another shade paler. How long until you can fix it? Commander, I am beginning to suspect that this problem cannot be solved within the framework of current galactic science. We may need to completely rebuild the system using entirely new principles. Such a project would take years and cost more than most worlds produce in a decade. The words hit Krell like a punch to the gut. Years meant his career was over. Years meant 17 star systems would remain cut off from each other. Years meant colonies would die waiting for supplies that couldn't be coordinated without the relay. There must be something, Krell said. Some solution we haven't tried. Commander, the greatest minds in the galaxy have examined this problem. If we cannot solve it, then perhaps it simply cannot be solved. Krell left the relay room feeling like he was walking to his own execution. The corridors of Nexus Prime buzzed with activity as usual, but everything felt different now. Alien merchants argued over prices in a dozen languages. Maintenance crews hurried past carrying tools he couldn't identify. Ships docked and undocked in the distance with the sound of metal on metal echoing through the station's hull. He made his way to the docking bay control center to check the daily traffic reports. Maybe keeping busy with routine work would help him forget about the impossible problem eating away at his career and sanity. The reports showed typical activity. Cargo haulers from the rim worlds bringing rare metals and exotic foods. Passenger liners carrying tourists and business travelers. Research vessels heading out to study distant phenomena. One entry caught his eye. The Lucky 7, registry number H2847. Pilot Jake Morrison, carrying medical supplies and communication equipment for the outer stations. Another human courier making his regular rounds. Krell had seen dozens of them over the years. Humans were reliable if nothing else. They showed up on time, delivered what they promised, and didn't cause trouble. Not very exciting, but dependable, if only fixing the relay could be that simple. Jake Morrison guided his ship through the approach pattern to Nexus Prime's docking bay 7. The Lucky 7 wasn't much to look at compared to the sleek alien vessels around it. She was a blocky human cargo hauler with patches welded over. Old meteor impacts and engines that ran a little rough on the port side. But she had carried Jake safely across half the galaxy for 8 years, and he wouldn't trade her for anything. The docking computer guided him into his assigned berth with mechanical precision. Jake went through his post-flight checklist while the station's atmosphere pumps pressurized the bay around his ship. He had 48 cases of medical supplies bound for the research station at Kepler 442 and a box of communication parts that some mining colony had ordered 6 months ago. Simple cargo for simple people living simple lives on the edge of nowhere. He opened the cargo bay and started moving boxes onto his loading cart. The medical supplies were marked with biohazard symbols in 17 different languages. The communication parts rattled when he moved them, but the shipping manifest said they were supposed to do that. Jake had learned not to ask too many questions about what he carried as long as it was legal and paid on delivery. The station's cargo bay was busy as always. Alien workers moved containers that seemed to float on their own. Mechanical arms reached down from the ceiling to grab pallets and carry them away to storage areas. Strange smells drifted through the air from a dozen different worlds. Jake had gotten used to most of it over the years, but sometimes he still caught a whiff of something that made his eyes water. He was loading the last box onto his cart when he heard voices coming from the maintenance corridor that ran along the side of the bay. The voices were speaking in Galactic Standard, which most spacers learned eventually. But with accents he recognized as ethereal collective. Those were the energy beings who didn't have solid bodies and lived inside containment fields that looked like glowing clouds. The quantum coherence patterns remained stable in isolation, but collapsed immediately upon integration with the primary matrix. One voice was saying, It suggests a fundamental incompatibility between the relay's core architecture and the local space-time substrate. Perhaps the problem lies not in our understanding, but in the nature of reality itself in this region. Another voice replied, "The gravitational anomalies near this system may be creating quantum interference patterns that our models cannot account for." Jake had heard enough technical discussions over the years to know they were talking about the station's broken communication system. Everyone who came through Nexus Prime had heard about it by now. The relay that connected 17 star systems had been down for months. Trade was suffering. People were getting desperate. He pushed his cart toward the cargo office to get his delivery confirmed, but the voices from the corridor kept talking. Zephyrs believes the problem may be fundamentally unsolvable within the current framework of galactic engineering principles. The first voice said, "Perhaps we should recommend complete system replacement. The cost would be enormous. 17 worlds would have to contribute resources for a project that might take decades to complete." Jake paused in his walking. Complete system replacement sounded like the kind of expensive solution that engineers loved to propose when they couldn't figure out what was actually wrong. He'd seen it happen before on mining stations and research outposts. Something would break, the experts would spend months studying it, and finally they'd declare that the only solution was to tear everything out and start over. Usually the problem turned out to be something simple that everyone had overlooked while they were busy being brilliant. The cargo office was staffed by a Saurian clerk who processed Jake's delivery paperwork with efficient boredom. The medical supplies were signed for and tagged for immediate transfer to the Kepler 442 transport. The communication parts went into general storage to wait for the next ship heading toward the outer mining colonies. Simple transactions that happened thousands of times every day across the galaxy. Jake was heading back to his ship when the station's intercom crackled to life. "All senior staff to emergency briefing room 7 immediately." All senior staff to emergency briefing room 7. That sounded serious. Jake had been making deliveries to Nexus Prime long enough to know that emergency briefings usually meant something expensive was about to break or something expensive was already broken and getting worse. Given what he'd overheard about the relay problems, this was probably related. He was curious enough to take a detour on his way back to the Lucky 7 briefing room. 7 was in the administrative section of the station, which meant it was decorated with expensive materials and filled with comfortable furniture that most of the beings using it couldn't actually sit in. Jake had been there once before to give a witness report about a shipping incident. The corridors leading to the briefing room were busier than usual. Aliens of every description hurried past carrying data tablets and looking worried. He recognized some of them as the engineering teams he'd seen around the station over the past few months. The ones who were supposed to be fixing the relay. Jake found himself walking behind a group of crystalline architects. They moved like living geometry, all angles and faceted surfaces that caught the light in strange ways. They were discussing quantum resonance frequencies and mathematical terms that sounded like music to Jake's ears. Even though he didn't understand any of it, the briefing room was packed when Jake arrived. Commander Krell stood at the front looking like he hadn't slept in weeks. His scales had gone from green to gray and his uniform looked rumpled. Behind him was a holographic display showing a schematic of the relay system with warning lights blinking all over it. "The situation has reached critical status," Krell was saying. "Without the relay, 3 colony worlds will be cut off from emergency medical supply shipments within 72 hours. The Galactic Council has made it clear that failure to restore communications will result in immediate shutdown of Nexus Prime and criminal prosecution of senior staff." The assembled beings murmured among themselves in a dozen different languages. Jake recognized fear when he heard it, regardless of what species was making the sound. Dr. Vorthak stood up from his position near the front of the room. His four-brained head was still steaming slightly from overwork. "Commander, my team has exhausted every conventional approach to this problem. The relay system appears to be suffering from a cascade failure that exists outside the parameters of known physics. We may need to accept that some problems cannot be solved with current technology." "That's not acceptable, Doctor," There has to be something we haven't tried. Sir, we have examined every component, every connection, every quantum pathway in the system. We have run diagnostic routines that push the boundaries of what our equipment can measure. We have consulted with the greatest minds in 17 different fields of study. If a solution exists, it is beyond our ability to find it. Jake found himself standing near the back of the room, trying to stay out of the way. He wasn't supposed to be here anyway. This was clearly a meeting for important people, not cargo pilots who delivered boxes for a living. But something about the conversation bothered him. All these brilliant beings with their advanced degrees and sophisticated equipment, and none of them could fix what was probably a fairly straightforward engineering problem. In Jake's experience, the more complicated everyone said a problem was, the more likely it was that the actual solution was something simple that everyone had overlooked. He'd seen mining equipment worth millions of credits shut down for weeks because nobody thought to check if the air filters needed cleaning. He'd watched entire research stations lose power because a cable had worked loose and nobody looked at the basic connections while they were busy analyzing the exotic energy readings. The meeting was winding down with assignments for continued monitoring and analysis. The various engineering teams would keep working on different aspects of the problem. Everyone would file reports and attend more meetings and probably fail just as completely as they had been failing for months. Jake was about to leave when he heard his own voice saying, "Excuse me, but has anyone checked the power regulators?" The room went completely silent. Every alien eye, sensor, and perception organ turned toward the scruffy human in the worn jumpsuit standing by the door. Jake felt his face turn red, but it was too late to take the words back now. Commander Krell stared at Jake Morrison like he'd never seen a human before. The briefing room was so quiet that Jake could hear the station's air recycling systems humming in the walls. 47 of the galaxy's most advanced beings were looking at him with expressions that ranged from confusion to outright amusement. "I'm sorry," Krell said slowly. "Who are you exactly?" "Jake Morrison, sir. Pilot of the cargo ship Lucky 7. I make regular deliveries here." Jake's voice sounded smaller than he'd intended in the large room full of important people. Dr. Vorthak's 4 brains were apparently working at full capacity because steam started rising from his head again. "Commander, this human appears to be suggesting that we have overlooked basic power supply diagnostics. I feel I should point out that power distribution analysis was completed in the first week of our investigation. One of the crystalline architects made a sound like wind chimes in a hurricane." Jake had learned enough about their species to recognize laughter. "The primitive biped believes it can solve what we cannot," it said in a voice like breaking glass. "How amusing." Zephes, the energy being from the ethereal collective, floated closer to Jake. The containment field around him pulsed with colors that had no names in any human language. "Young courier, your species has been spacefaring for less than 200 of your years. You have barely begun to understand the basic principles of faster-than-light communication. What could you possibly offer to this discussion?" Jake felt his embarrassment turning into irritation. He'd been making cargo runs for 8 years, and he'd seen this kind of attitude before. Aliens who thought humans were too primitive to understand real technology. Most of the time he just ignored it and did his job. But 3 colony worlds were about to be cut off from medical supplies because these brilliant beings couldn't fix a communication system. "Sir, I've worked on relay systems before," Jake said. "Nothing as big as this one, but the basic principles are the same. When something stops working after months of operation, it's usually because a component has failed somewhere in the support systems." Dr. Vorthak's tentacles writhed with what Jake recognized as annoyance. "Human, we have tested every component in this system multiple times. Our diagnostic equipment can detect failures at the quantum level. Your primitive tools could not even measure the forces we work with." "Maybe that's the problem," Jake said before he could stop himself. The room erupted in confused chatter as aliens discussed this strange human suggestion in their native languages. Commander Krell held up his hand for silence. He looked desperate. Enough to listen to anyone at this point. Mr. Morrison, are you suggesting that our equipment is too sophisticated? I'm saying that sometimes when you're looking for complicated problems, you miss the simple ones. In my experience, when expensive equipment stops working, it's usually because something cheap has broken. Zephy's pulsed with what might have been indignation. The relay system represents the pinnacle of galactic engineering achievement. Every component has been designed and tested to operate flawlessly for centuries. The idea that some cheap part could cause system-wide failure is absurd. Then why isn't it working? Jake asked. The question hung in the air like an accusation. All these brilliant minds had been working on the problem for months without success. Maybe their brilliance was part of the problem, Commander Krell made. A decision that would probably end his career one way or another. Mr. Morrison, would you be willing to examine the relay system? The protest from the assembled engineers was immediate and loud. Dr. Vorthak stood up so quickly that his chair tipped over. Commander, you cannot be serious. This human could damage equipment worth more than his entire planet's gross domestic product. The liability alone. Doctor, the relay has been broken for 3 months. How much more damage could he possibly do? Krell's voice carried the weight of desperation and command authority. Mr. Morrison, you have 1 hour to look at whatever. You want to touch anything that might help. Break anything that needs to be broken. Just tell me if you can fix it. Jake nodded, suddenly aware that he'd gotten himself into something way over his head. Yes, sir. I'll need my toolkit from my ship. Take Security Escort Alpha 7 with you. They'll help carry whatever you need. 20 minutes later, Jake stood in the relay chamber holding his battered human toolkit and feeling very small. The room was even more impressive up close than it had looked in the briefings. The quantum relay itself rose from the floor like a metal mountain covered in crystal growths that sparkled with their own light. Energy flowed through transparent tubes in patterns that made his eyes hurt if he looked at them directly. The alien engineers had filled every available surface with monitoring equipment. Screens showed readouts in mathematics that might as well have been art to Jake's eyes. Sensors tracked particles he couldn't pronounce. Quantum analyzers measured forces he didn't understand. It was the most sophisticated diagnostic setup he'd ever seen. And none of it had found the problem. Jake opened his toolkit and pulled out a simple multimeter that he'd bought at a human electronics store 10 years ago. It was designed to measure basic electrical current, voltage, and resistance. Compared to the exotic equipment around him, it might as well have been a stone axe. Dr. Vorthak and 3 other engineers watched him with expressions of pain tolerance. Human, that device cannot possibly measure the forces at work in this system, Vorthak said. The quantum coherence patterns alone operate at energy levels your primitive instrument cannot detect. I'm not trying to measure quantum coherence. Patterns, Jake replied, walking around the base of the relay. I'm looking for power problems. He knelt down and opened an access panel that was barely noticeable among all the exotic components. Inside were rows of conventional power regulators, the kind that controlled electrical flow in systems throughout the galaxy. They were so common and reliable that most engineers forgot they existed. Jake clipped his multimeter leads to the first regulator and frowned at the reading. Then he checked the second one, and the third. By the time he checked the first dozen, he was starting to smile. Dr. Vorthak, how much power does this relay use when it's running? Approximately 47 terawatts at peak operation. Why? And how long has it been running at full power? The system was upgraded to handle increased traffic loads approximately 6 months ago. We expanded capacity by 30% to accommodate growing communication demands across the network. Jake checked 3 more power regulators and his smile got wider. Sir, when you upgraded the system, did anyone check if the power supply infrastructure could handle the increased load? Dr. Vorthak's 4 brains apparently stopped working for a moment because the steam rising from his head suddenly ceased. The power infrastructure was deemed adequate by the original installation team. Standard safety margins were incorporated into the design. When was the system originally installed? 14 years ago? Jake stood up and wiped his hands on his jumpsuit. Dr. Vorthak, 12 of your power regulators are burned out. They've been failing gradually over the past few months as the increased power load stressed components that were already at the end of their operational life. Your quantum systems have been trying to compensate for irregular power flow, creating more and more complex workarounds until the whole system finally collapsed. The silence in the relay chamber was different from the silence in the briefing room. This wasn't confusion or amusement. This was the silence of brilliant minds confronting an uncomfortable truth. Dr. Vorthak walked over to where Jake was kneeling and looked at the multimeter readings. His tentacles stopped writhing and hung limp at his sides. Impossible, he whispered. We tested the power systems. You tested the exotic power systems, Jake corrected. The quantum batteries, the antimatter conduits, the dark energy collectors, all the impressive stuff. But nobody checked the basic regulators that control the flow between all those systems. And the relay itself. Jake pointed to a burned-out component that was barely larger than his thumb. This little part costs about 12 credits at any electronic supplier in the galaxy. When it failed, your quantum system started working harder to maintain power stability. That stressed other regulators, which made the quantum systems work even harder. Eventually, the cascade failure reached a point where even your advanced systems couldn't compensate anymore. He looked up at the assembled engineers who were staring at the tiny failed component like it was an alien artifact. The solution is simple. Replace the burned-out regulators and install better surge protection. Total cost maybe 300 credits. Time to fix it about 6 hours. Dr. Vorthak sat down heavily on a piece of diagnostic equipment. We missed it, he said in a voice so quiet it was barely audible. We were so focused on the advanced systems that we never checked the simple ones. The next 6 hours on Nexus Prime were unlike anything the station had seen in its 40-year history. Word spread quickly through the corridors that a human cargo pilot had found the solution to the relay problem. Beings who had never given humans a second thought suddenly wanted to know everything about Jake Morrison and his simple multimeter. Dr. Vorthak sat in the relay chamber staring at the burned-out power regulators like they were puzzle pieces that didn't fit any picture. He understood. His 4 brains were working overtime trying to process how 28 teams of the galaxy's best engineers had missed something so basic. The quantum mathematics were perfect. The exotic physics calculations were flawless. The advanced diagnostic readings were exactly what they should be for a properly functioning system, but nobody had checked the 12-credit power regulators. How did we miss this? He said to his research assistant, a young cerebellan named Quintex who was busy running new scans on the failed components. Our diagnostic protocols are the most comprehensive in the galaxy. Quintex looked up from his scanner, his single brain working hard enough to produce a thin wisp of steam. Professor, our protocols are designed to detect quantum-level failures and exotic energy anomalies. These regulators failed through simple electrical overload. Our equipment doesn't even register failures at such mundane energy levels. Jake was lying on his back under the relay's main power distribution panel, using a simple human flashlight to examine connections that hadn't been looked at in over a decade. The alien engineers had focused all their attention on the beautiful, complex quantum components above. Nobody had crawled down into the boring maintenance spaces where the real work got done. Hand me that wrench, he called to Quintex, who passed him a tool that looked like it belonged in a museum compared to the sophisticated equipment around them. Commander. Krell arrived in the relay chamber looking like he'd aged 10 years in the past few hours. The Galactic Council had been sending him messages every 30 minutes demanding updates on the situation. 3 colony worlds were now less than 48 hours from medical supply crisis. If Jake's solution didn't work, Krell's career would be over and a lot of people would die. Mr. Morrison, what's your status? Krell asked, trying to keep the desperation out of his voice. Almost finished with the diagnostic phase, Commander. I've found 17 failed components in the power distribution system. Most of them are regulators, but there's also a transformer that's running way, too hot in a junction box that's corroded from moisture intrusion. Dr. Vorthak looked up from his contemplation of cosmic irony, moisture intrusion, in a sealed system. The seals are 20 years old, Doctor. Rubber degrades over time. Basic maintenance would have caught it. Jake crawled out from under the panel and sat up, wiping his hands on his already dirty jumpsuit. The good news is that all these components are standard throughout the galaxy. The station's fabrication shop can make new ones in about 4 hours. The bad news is that the power grid is so unstable right now that we'll have to shut down the entire relay system to make the repairs safely. Commander Krell felt his stomach drop. How long will the shutdown take? 6 hours total. 4 hours to fabricate parts, 2 hours to install and test everything. And if something goes wrong, Jake shrugged, then you're not any worse off than you are now, but it won't go wrong. This is basic electrical work. Zephy's floated into the relay chamber, his containment field pulsing with colors that Jake was beginning to recognize as confusion. The human's analysis appears to be correct, the energy being announced to the room. I have reviewed the power distribution logs for the past 6 months. The pattern of failures matches exactly with the degradation curve he described. Dr. Vorthak stood up slowly. Zephy's, you've been able to access the power distribution logs. Of course. They are stored in the station's main computer system. Why didn't we examine those logs during our investigation? Because power distribution is handled by basic maintenance systems, not the advanced engineering protocols we were using. Our diagnostic routines don't interface with such primitive data structures. Jake looked around at the assembled aliens and tried not to smile. Dr. Vorthak, with your permission, I'd like to start shutting down the relay system so we can begin repairs. The cerebellum scientist nodded slowly. Mr. Morrison, at this point you have more understanding of this system's actual problems than anyone else in this room. You have full authority to proceed as you see fit. The next 4 hours were a masterpiece of organized chaos. Jake worked with the station's maintenance crew to fabricate replacement components using the basic fabrication equipment in the industrial section, while the exotic engineering teams had been using advanced quantum manufacturing techniques to create perfect theoretical solutions. Jake was using simple metalworking tools to make simple parts that would actually fix the problem. The maintenance crew turned out to be surprisingly helpful. Most of them were from species that specialized in practical work rather than theoretical research. They understood the difference between elegant solutions and working solutions. A Thacarian welder named Grex helped Jake fabricate new junction boxes. A pair of mechanical collective engineers provided precise measurements for the replacement regulators. You know, Grex said while attaching a new power coupling, we suggested checking the basic power systems back in week 2. Nobody listened to us because we're just maintenance workers. Jake paused in his work installing a new transformer. What did you tell them? That the power consumption readings were higher than normal and some of the old regulators were running hot. The engineering team said their quantum diagnostics showed all systems operating within normal parameters. The quantum diagnostics were right, Jake said. The advanced systems were working perfectly. They were just working perfectly to compensate for failing basic systems. Word of the repair effort had spread throughout Nexus Prime, Cargo Bay 7, where Jake's ship was docked, had become an impromptu gathering place for beings who wanted to see the human who had solved the impossible problem. Merchants, travelers, and off-duty station personnel crowded around to get a look at the Lucky Seven and her unremarkable pilot, Dr. Lisa Chun. A human freight hauler who ran supplies to the outer colonies found Jake during his dinner break. Morrison, you've got half the galaxy talking about you. The news services are calling it the biggest engineering breakthrough in decades. Jake nearly choked on his sandwich. It's not a breakthrough, Lisa. It's basic maintenance that should have been done years ago. Tell that to the 17th star. Systems that are about to get their communications back. 2 hours ahead of schedule, Jake finished installing the last replacement component. The relay chamber looked exactly the same as it had that morning, except for a few small metal boxes that most beings wouldn't even notice. Dr. Vorthak and his team had their exotic monitoring equipment ready to track every quantum particle during the startup sequence. All right, everyone, Jake called out. We're going to bring the system back online slowly. If anything looks wrong, we shut it down immediately. He reached for the main power switch, then paused. Dr. Vorthak, would you like to do the honors? The cerebellum scientist looked at Jake with an expression that might have been gratitude or embarrassment or both. Mr. Morrison, this is your repair. You should be the one to test it. Jake flipped the switch. The quantum relay hummed to life with a sound like music played on crystal instruments. Energy began flowing through the transparent tubes in perfect, stable patterns. The monitoring screens that had been showing chaos for months suddenly displayed neat, orderly readouts. Commander Krell's communicator chimed with incoming messages from all 17 star systems in the network. Medical supply shipments were being coordinated. Trade negotiations were resuming. Families separated by light years. We're talking to each other again. Dr. Vorthak stood watching the displays showing perfect system operation. It works, he said quietly. After months of failure, it works. Jake packed his simple tools back into his battered toolkit. Doctor, it was always working. It just needed someone to fix the parts that weren't. 3 days later, Jake Morrison sat in his ship's small cargo bay, reading messages on his personal communicator and trying to understand how his simple life had suddenly become so complicated. The first message was from the Galactic Engineering Institute offering him a full professorship with tenure. The second was from the Vega System Authority requesting his consultation on a failing terraforming project. The third was from a documentary producer who wanted to make a film about the human who solved the impossible problem. He deleted all of them and went back to checking his cargo manifest for the next run to the Kepler system. Commander Krell had tried to give him the Order of Galactic Service, the highest civilian honor the station could award. Jake had politely declined, saying he was just doing what needed to be done. The commander then offered him a permanent position as chief engineering consultant with a salary that would have made him wealthy by any standard in known space. Jake declined that too. Mr. Morrison, Krell had said during their final meeting, you understand that word of your achievement is spreading throughout the galaxy. Universities are revising their engineering curricula to include basic diagnostic procedures. The Cerebellum Science Academy is establishing a new department of practical problem solving. You started a revolution in how we approach complex technical challenges. Jake had just shrugged and said he hoped it would help people fix their problems faster in the future. Dr. Vorthak had been the most changed by the experience. The four-brain scientist had spent the past 3 days completely reorganizing his research methodology. He'd published a paper titled The Fallacy of Advanced Solutions to Basic Problems. That was already being discussed in academic circles across 17 worlds. Mr. Morrison, he'd said when he came to say goodbye, you have taught me something. More valuable than 40 years of advanced education? Sometimes the most sophisticated mind can be defeated by the simplest oversight. I will never again begin a diagnostic procedure without first checking the basic systems. Jake had appreciated that more than all the fancy awards and job offers, Dr. Vorthak was a good scientist who had just been looking in the wrong direction. Now he knew to look everywhere. The story of the relay repair had indeed spread throughout the galaxy faster than the messages the relay itself carried. News services called it everything from the triumph of human practicality to the day engineering changed forever. Academic journals published analysis of what they called the Morrison method. Trade publications ran articles about the importance of basic maintenance in advanced systems. Jake found most of it embarrassing. He hadn't done anything special, just applied common sense to a problem that everyone else was making too complicated. But apparently common sense was rarer in the galaxy than he'd thought. The crystalline architects had sent him a formal apology for their dismissive attitude, along with a beautiful crystal sculpture that probably cost more than his ship. The energy beings from the ethereal collective had offered to share their advanced consciousness expansion techniques with him. Even the mechanical collective had invited him to tour their primary manufacturing worlds. He'd politely declined all of it. Jake Morrison was a cargo pilot, not a celebrity or a consultant or a professor. He had schedules to keep and deliveries to make. Simple work for simple people living simple lives on the edge of nowhere. His communicator chimed with another message. This one was from Captain Lisa Chun, who was currently hauling medical supplies to a research station in the Tau Ceti system. Jake, you're famous. The news services are calling you the most important human in the galaxy. How does it feel to be a hero? Jake typed back a short reply. Feels like I need to get back to work before my regular customers find other shipping companies. But even as he tried to return to his normal routine, Jake found that normal wasn't quite the same anymore. Station personnel who had barely noticed him before now greeted him by name in the corridors. Alien engineers asked his opinion on problems they were working on. The docking bay supervisor had assigned him a permanent berth in the premium section, usually reserved for diplomatic vessels. Most surprising of all, he'd started getting requests for help from other stations. Not the big, prestigious assignments that famous consultants received, but practical problems from practical people who needed practical solutions. A mining colony whose atmospheric processors were acting up. A research station with communication issues. A freight depot where the cargo handling systems kept breaking down. Simple problems that probably had simple solutions. But the local experts were too busy looking for complicated answers to find them. Jake's personal communicator chimed again. This time it was a message from the communication relay on Station Beta Prime, 3 systems away. Their primary data router had been malfunctioning for 2 weeks. 7 different technical teams had examined it without success. The station commander was requesting Jake's assistance and offering to pay standard consulting rates plus travel expenses. Jake looked at the message for a long time. He could ignore it and go back to his regular cargo runs. He could pretend that fixing the Nexus Prime relay had been a one-time lucky guess and that he wasn't really qualified to solve other people's technical problems, or he could admit that maybe the galaxy needed someone who thought differently about how to fix things. He composed a reply to Station Beta Prime. Will arrive in 6 days. Bring your technical specifications and a complete maintenance history. Also bring a basic multimeter and someone who knows where the power comes from. 3 hours later, Jake guided the Lucky 7 out of Nexus Primes docking bay and set course for Beta Prime. His cargo hold contained the usual mix of supplies and equipment, but this time he was carrying something else too. A small reputation as the human who could fix impossible problems by making them simple again. The galaxy was a big place full of complicated technology and brilliant minds. Most of the time that worked out fine, but occasionally someone needed to crawl under the fancy equipment and check if the basic parts were still working. Jake Morrison was apparently that someone. As the Lucky 7 jumped to hyperspace, Jake settled back in his pilot's chair and smiled. He still had deliveries to make and schedules to keep, but now he also had a new kind of cargo to carry. Common sense, delivered wherever it was needed most. Behind him, Nexus Prime continued its busy operations with perfect communication flowing to 17 star systems. In the relay chamber, Dr. Vorthak was training a new generation of engineers to always check the simple things first. The station's maintenance crews had been given new authority to speak up when they noticed basic problems. And in academic institutions across the galaxy, professors were learning to teach their students that sometimes the most advanced solution was knowing when to use the simplest one. Jake's communicator showed 3 more requests for consultation waiting in his message queue. A terraforming project with atmospheric issues, a space elevator with structural problems, a quantum computer that kept crashing for unknown reasons. He would get to them all eventually. Right now, he had a mining colony that needed spare parts and a research station waiting for communication equipment. Simple deliveries for simple people, but if those people happened to have complicated problems that needed simple solutions, well, Jake Morrison would be happy to take a look. After all, someone had to keep the basic things working while everyone else was busy being brilliant. The galaxy was learning that sometimes the most important job was the one that nobody else wanted to do. And sometimes the most valuable person was the one who remembered that everything complicated was built on something simple. Jake checked his navigation display and adjusted course for his next delivery. Just another routine day in the life of a cargo pilot who happened to be very good at his job.